we're going to talk a little bit about fall, winter hive configurations. And so this is really talking about, kind of what Lauren got into. If you've got a single box, can you overwinter in a single box? Should you have two deep boxes? Should you have a deep and a medium? What and why? And in this discussion, we're going to talk about brood boxes, not honey supers. Okay. So we're not talking about in March adding honey supers. We're talking about what should our hives have as brood nests. So that area below the honey supers where the brood is being reared. So how much space do bees actually need? So a queen laying at full capacity, so as fast as she can keep 8 to 10 deep frames full of brood. Okay. So not a whole lot, it only takes 8 to 10 deep frames. That's when a queen starts maxing out. But they need more space than that because they've got to put honey somewhere too for storage. So some general rules of thumb as we kind of get into this topic. Number one, except during or right before a honey flow, I recommend each hive having 30 to 40 pounds of excess honey or syrup stored in a second brood box in general. Number two, in January through September, when the top box becomes 80% full of bees or honey, you can add an additional box. Number three, through October through December, keep rule number one in mind. And if a third or fourth box is 25% or less full of bees or honey, remove it and store it for next spring. So those are some general rules of thumb to consider as we go through here. Okay, so let's think about one deep brood nest. Okay, so there's some pros and cons. So Lauren talked about, you absolutely can overwinter with one deep box. Bees in Texas can survive that. Some of the pros are that less equipment's needed. You don't need as many upper boxes. You can harvest more honey if you run a single story hive year round because their bees are going to be keeping that bottom box exclusively almost full of brood, and they're going to put all the honey up in the upper boxes. Some cons are in Texas, you can overheat a hive. It's a strong single, especially if it's in partial shade, can over summer okay, but they're more prone to overheating. Swarming is a much greater consideration because once they fill up that bottom box, they can swarm quickly in the spring or summer, as opposed to having multiple boxes where they're a little less likely to swarm. And you might have to do more frequent feeding in the summer and winter because they can't store up quite as much honey in a single story hive. So you may have to do more feeding. A deep and a medium, or one deep and one medium is a brood nest. Some of the pros are that it's kind of the precise amount of brood and honey storage for a hive. They can fill that bottom box with brood, and they can put 30 to 40 pounds of honey or syrup stored in the second box. So it's a great configuration. The medium box is lighter than the second deep box, so that's a pro. Some of the cons would be it's more complicated to do your spring splits. So if you want to split again next spring, that medium box kind of gets in the way. That's a con. They're slightly more frequent feeding than double deeps, and then it's slightly more increased swarming potential than double deep hives. But in my opinion, for Texas, a story and a half, a deep and a medium, is a great way to go. And it's also a great way to overwinter. A deep box, 2 deep boxes for brood nests. Some advantages to that is it's easier to split in the spring because you've already got 2 deep boxes. You can just equalize the brood, equalize the honey, pull them apart. There's your split. There's extra room for the queen to lay. So there's plenty of room for the queen to lay. There's extra room for honey stores. So you might have to check them a little less frequently. So especially if you're not living near your hives, it's convenient. There's extra room during summer months, again, so they can store extra honey. Some of the cons are that second deep box is really heavy if it's full of honey. So if your weight is an issue for you, that is a con. They tend to store a little bit of too much honey in that second box during the honey flow. So you may not be able to harvest quite as much honey because, again, they put a lot of honey up in that second box. Double deeps are most commonly used for commercial beekeepers. We use that all the time, but it's often because we're putting our bees on a semi truck and shipping them across the country, and they need that room to stay cool. But then we also can't be in our hives every single week to feed if they need it. So those are kind of some pros and cons when it comes to what configuration. Any configuration can work. My typical recommendation for new beekeepers is a deep and a medium or 2 deep boxes. I usually push people to a deep and a medium if you're a small scale beekeeper, because it's kind of the perfect configuration where they've got plenty of room for honey, they've got plenty of room for bees, but they're not going to store 60 pounds of your honey over the honey flow in that, like they would in a deep box. So you're going to harvest a little more honey than if it was 2 deep boxes. So, but any work. The single can work. It's not quite as ideal in my opinion because it takes a little more management on your part. Some risks with having too many boxes on a hive, and I'm not talking about 2, I'm talking about, okay, what if we have 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 boxes, not during a honey flow, but after a honey flow. You can have wax moth and small hive beetle damage in those upper boxes if there's not enough bees to keep them under control. If you put down too many boxes, you can also have a chimneying effect where the bees like to move up. As a general rule of thumb, you can have them move up and fill up the middle 3 or 4 frames in 5 boxes. And so instead of filling up one box completely and going to the next, they'll just shoot straight up the middle instead of filling out and utilizing each one appropriately. There's a kind of a common myth that if you have too many boxes on a hive, they won't be able to keep the hive cool in the winter. That's not really the case. The bees tend to keep their cluster warm, not all the space inside of a box. So too many boxes isn't really too much of an issue going into winter. So some risks. Oops. Oh, sorry. I went too far there. So risks and then robbing. I didn't touch that one. That's what that little video was. If you have too many boxes for the bees to defend, you can have robber bees try to move in. Risks with not enough boxes. So I'm sorry, that picture isn't loading. If you don't have enough boxes on a hive, swarming can be a risk. You can have honey-bound hives. Sometimes if a hive is honey-bound, you need to add another box so they can move some of that honey out. You can have overheating. You can have no honey crop because if they honey-bound a hive and shut the queen down, then you can actually have the hive really die. If you don't have enough boxes, then you can have no excess honey stores for the winter, or you may not be able to harvest honey at all. So, there's a picture. Better late than never, I guess. So let me go back a little bit and touch on a few topics. So kind of answering the question, what is ideal going into winter? What I usually recommend is that when any box is about 80% full of bees, it's time to add another box. That's not true after about mid-September. So if your top box right now, if you've got 2 deep boxes and your top box right now is 80% full, I would go ahead and add maybe a medium box right now, and they may draw it out and fill it up over September. And as long as each box, as you go into the fall and winter, as long as each box is at least, I'm going to say 30 to 40% full of honey or bees, I'm okay leaving it. Even throughout the whole winter. If you've got a whole box that has maybe half a frame or a frame of honey in it and virtually no bees, go ahead and pull it off there. But as long as there's a significant amount of honey and a significant amount of bees in a box, I usually just leave it on. Usually bees aren't going to fill up more than, I'm going to say, 2 or 3 total boxes through the winter. It's pretty rare that they would need more space than that. But if they're filling that up, then hey, I would go ahead and leave it over the course of the winter. So if you've got, now if you've got the flip side where you've got maybe 1 deep brood box that's full of bees and honey, and you've got a second box that they never drew out and isn't full of anything, I would leave it on there till about the 1st of October, hoping that if you're trickle feeding and you get a bit of a fall flow, that they go ahead and draw that out or fill it up. If by the 1st of October, that second box still doesn't have any significant amount of bees or honey in it, go ahead and pull it off. And at that point, I would just overwinter as a single story hive, which, as Lauren talked about, is fine. You can overwinter a single story as long as it's got the adequate bee population. You just may have to check them a little more frequently, maybe check them every 2 or 3 weeks. Make sure that they've still got at least, I'm going to say, 3 or 4 frames full of honey. And if they don't, you may have to keep feed on them over the course of the winter. Bees don't really drink much syrup or eat much food that you give to them throughout the winter because it's too cold. But on warm days, they still will bounce up there and drink that syrup. So